Welcome everyone to week 3 in Geography 4880. Can't believe it's already week 3. I apologize for the delay in getting these pre-recorded lectures to you, but you should have plenty of time to watch them, review them, reflect on them, and write up your discussion board post by Thursday evening. So this week our topic is reading the landscape. We're going to look at that as a lens on the world that geographers have developed over the past several decades through the subfields or perspectives of thought that we can come to know as geohumanities or humanistic geographies and critical human geography. So let's start here with reading the landscape. What does it mean to read the landscape? Well, take this landscape, for instance, and I will tell you that this is somewhere between Guelph and Milton. Not entirely sure, but in the green belt, somewhere between those two cities. And just start by observing what's here. What do you actually see? You don't have to make any sort of interpretation yet, but what are some of the elements of this landscape that are visible to you here? Once you start picking out those elements, you can begin to make interpretations and ask questions in order to understand the meaning, the significance, and the workings of this landscape. So for instance, I noticed a few things here. I noticed the field in the middle distance that has a bunch of yellow flowers and small pine trees. I noticed the fence. I noticed the clear-cut grass here rather than crops. Those are things that stood out to me, being somewhat familiar with this area. And then I can begin to ask questions about this landscape to understand what its meaning is, what its significance is, and how it works. So I might ask, why is this field in the middle distance like that? And I might begin to wonder about some of the restoration activities that have been going on in the Greenbelt in order to restore streams and other natural areas. So it looks like this is beginning to be restored to connect the forest in the background there. Okay, and so I could begin to make a biogeographical or physical geography assessment of this landscape. Okay, just by starting from a point of looking at it, picking out those elements, beginning to ask questions of it. I also noticed the fence here and the grass that kind of looks like a lawn. Okay, but I assure you, or at least my hunch is that this is not a lawn. Okay, so it makes me think of many of the horse farms that are in the area between Guelph and Milton and the Greenbelt. And so then I could begin to think about, okay, well, why is it that there are so many horse farms in this area? And I could begin to start to connect some dots in terms of how this region works in terms of production and consumption. In many ways, the area between Guelph and Milton is sort of a landscape of consumption for relatively wealthy people from Toronto to enjoy outdoors experiences like horseback riding, camping, in some ways hiking, bike riding, driving their fancy cars. These are all things that we see and experience in the Greenbelt, or at least I do, because I enjoy going out this way. Okay, so just this pretty innocuous image or photo can become a real source of geographical inquiry. Obviously, we have to have some background knowledge in order to make sense of it, but this is the sort of approach that reading the landscape takes. It takes images like this one, or maybe perhaps ones that are richer and have more elements in them, and begins to tell ask questions about the landscape and tell stories about it. So we're going to look at some of the researchers who have adopted and innovated around the notion of landscape over the past several decades. But first, we'll start with some high-level context and overview for this kind of research. We'll start here with the emergence of radical and critical human geography in the 1970s or so. So we just barely touched on this at the end of last week. We are going to explore it more fully in depth this week. So this emergence really reflected broader societal and institutional trends. Okay, the late 1960s and early 1970s were a moment of huge societal upheaval in the West and really around the world. Okay, where civil rights movements of various kinds, women's movements, really came to the forefront of a lot of different aspects of society. And academia, the ivory tower, was not immune to that. Okay, so radical and critical human geographers at this time really sought to identify and explain inequalities and conflict. Okay, so rather than focusing on how to model urban landscapes in order to best predict, where to build a suburb, radical and critical human geographers sought to actually intervene in questions around inequality and conflicts that were occurring between groups of people at this time. Okay, and so this was really building and responding to criticisms about the spatial science of urban and economic geography that we discussed in depth last week. Okay, where those approaches took a positivist tack to understanding cities and space in general. And instead, radical and critical human geographers at this time said, okay, we actually need to not just understand how cities work, but to contribute to reshaping them in fundamental ways, not just optimizing the planning of suburbs. And so this was emerging alongside the broader philosophical perspective on research and knowledge at the time, known as structuralism. We've already started to explore this. Structuralism says that society, culture, and individual behavior must be understood in relation to overarching systems and institutions that we can't visibly see, okay? These structures are not something we can necessarily touch or feel as positivists and empiricists might want us to focus on in order to produce valid knowledge. Instead, the structuralists say, actually, the most valid knowledge is that which tries to get at underlying causes, mechanisms, and structures that are things that we cannot see, but nonetheless matter for how society develops. So these are things like language, government laws and policies, very basic things that we now understand as really important, but that we're seen as, things that we couldn't really research even just decades ago under a positivist regime, because they couldn't necessarily be measured. And in particular, we'll focus on this one here, the economy, okay? And in particular, relationships between firms, between laborers and firms, okay? And this structuralist element or focus on the economy is really influenced by Marx, who really laid bare how modern culture, the sort of structural determinants of modern culture, conflict and change are capitalist labor relations. And so the structurists were really out to prove law-like codes for the beliefs and behavior of people. Okay, in many ways, similar to what we saw the spatial scientists and positivists out to do last week, in terms of coming up with generalized laws for how societies work. Okay, the difference is that the structuralists were not reliant solely on empirically observed phenomenon. Instead, they are positing that there are these underlying structures that guide and shape how relationships unfold in society. So how does this play out in geography? Well, structuralism in geography really takes the shape of Marxist geographies, which we write about in chapter 7. And really the core question in Marxist geographies is this situation, whether it's inequality in urban areas, whether it's refugees migrating or trying to migrate around the world, is it any of the things that you read about in chapter 7, is that situation simply the way it is, a result of accident, luck, natural advantage, or disadvantage? In other words, is it so-called simple geography, or is it the necessary outcome of something systematic and unjust, a structure perhaps underneath all that? And indeed, the Marxist geographers would say it's the latter, okay? And so we see this perspective take off in geography with David Harvey, who used to be a spatial scientist of the kind we explored last week, jumping the ship, okay, in the early 70s. And at that time, he thought that the kinds of geographic theory that spatial scientists or economic geographers were producing is simply reinforcing the state of affairs rather than changing them, okay? And he made a challenge to positivism. So he said, we need to, or he basically said, we need to rid ourselves of the conditions that make data-driven theories true, data-driven theories of positivism, okay? So whereas positivist spatial science approach to conditions in Detroit in the 1970s might say, well, our model predicts that people should be poor, and they are, so our model, our theory is true. That might work, but folks like David Harvey said, well, what does that actually do for our understanding of the world? How does that actually help us? You might be right, but the point is not simply to understand and theorize about the world, but to actually change it. So these were the kinds of questions that structuralists, and in particular Marxist geographers, were raising at the time. So how does this all work? Well, a key concept here is the notion of historical materialism, which posits, it's a general approach that posits a way of explaining everything from economy to culture and its development over time and long periods of time, okay? We're talking about big notions here like feudalism and capitalism and so on. So the idea behind historical materialism is that productive forces, okay, the sorts of technologies as well as resources that we harness in order to make a living out of the world, okay, those particular kinds of technologies and resources give rise to particular relations of production between different people, okay, and which in turn give rise to particular economic systems. And ultimately then those economic systems shape cultures, okay? So as an example, productive forces here might include factories and looms and all the other accoutrements of the Industrial Revolution, which historical materialists would say would give rise to particular relations of productions, okay? So, capitalists, individuals own factories. They own the kinds of woolen mills that we saw in the Industrial Revolution, okay? And they employ laborers who do not own those things to work in those factories, okay? And those laborers must go work in those factories in order to make money, in order to buy food, because they do not have land, another productive force, okay? And that gives rise, that system, that set of relations, and relations are not something we can see, right? This is why it's structuralism. We can't see relations, but we can certainly describe them. That set of relations gives rise to something known as capitalism, which in turn, according to historical materialists, gives us all the sorts of culture and ideology that we see in a capitalist society. Okay, so that's the idea, really at the heart of Marxism and Marxist geographies. So then the question becomes, well, what does geography have to do with it? This just sounds like economics. Well, the real innovation that folks like David Harvey had at this time is to recognize the role of space in all this, okay? And in particular, to see space as not simply an empty container in which the relations of production are unfold, or by which capitalists go out and get the productive forces and build their factories or get access to land or whatever. Space not as an empty container or sort of this fundamental category of existence like the Kantians, those philosophers might have, but as produced through the actions of people, and in particular as the result of the relations of production. That is, the relations between those who own the means of production, own factories, own everything else that enables us to build the things and make a livelihood and survive, okay? And those who do not own those things, okay, as in workers. And Marxist geographers also recognize that this is true of nature, okay? Another key geographical concept. Nature is not just out there beyond the influence of humans, but is also, just like space, something that is produced. And it is not just produced in an individual ad hoc fashion, okay, but under the imperatives and motives of capitalism, okay? That is to say, under its relations of production, where some folks own the means of producing goods and services, and some folks don't. And under the imperative of profit, okay? So this quote here from Neil Smith, who we'll see later, whether we're talking about the laborious conversion of iron ore into steel and ultimately automobiles, or the professional packaging of national park in the US like Yellowstone, nature is produced. It's made up to be something. It's not to say that nature's just invented, okay, but that we end up thinking about it, managing it, and so on in ways that align not with its so-called first or primordial state, but in ways that align with things like profit and trying to extract money out of it, and basically subservient it to whatever capitalism needs to continue its existence. So another example here in terms of the degradation of the environment would be something like soil erosion. So we might see soil erosion and think, well, it's just the ignorance of farmers around the world, okay? But those influenced by Marxist geographers would say, well, actually, remember, nature is produced. That means even sort of the harms that we do that we perpetuate on the environment are produced. So something like soil erosion is not a product of ignorant farmers as much as it is a product of the structure of the global economy, okay? Where poor people are simply attempting to extract as much as they can from the land to compensate from the fact that someone else is extracting labor and from them, okay? And so this approach is something that we'll see in the next mini lecture was and still is strongly resisted by geographers influenced by the humanities. So we'll pick it up there.